Hey guys, tonight we wander into a cozy corner of history that you probably won't survive unless you love trivia as much as sleep. Imagine yourself in the smoky salons of early 19th century Europe, where political gossip flows thicker than the steam rising off your evening tea. You're settling in, letting the warm buzz of candlelight and the murmur of aristocrats drift over you. But here's the catch. You're about to dive deep into one of history's quirkiest misconceptions, Napoleon Bonaparte's height. Yes, that's right. The famous French general and emperor who conquered so much territory is famously thought of as short, almost like a pocket-sized warrior. But what if I told you that this is mostly a myth, a long-running joke, fueled by misunderstandings and clever propaganda? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the cobbled streets of post-revolutionary Paris, the air thick with anticipation and revolution's echo. Napoleon, barely 5'6" by today's standards, might seem unremarkable at first glance, but back then, his stature was a hot topic. The rumor that he was tiny is often traced back to British political cartoons and propaganda. The Brits, locked in fierce conflict with France, delighted in portraying Napoleon as a miniature menace. A man so small he needed to stand on a pile of books to command attention. You almost expect the cartoons to show him riding a hamster instead of a horse. This British smear campaign had a clever purpose: paint your enemy as less intimidating, and you chip away at their authority without firing a single cannonball. So, as you drift into this fog of early 19th century geopolitics, remember that these cartoons were less about fact and more about ridicule. Historians still argue whether this early caricature was the real start of the short Napoleon myth, or if his actual height was genuinely mismeasured. But let's pause and listen to the echo of the French soldiers who fought alongside him. To them, Napoleon was not a short, insignificant figure, but a leader who could inspire thousands and strategize battles that changed Europe's map. The French even called him Le Petit Caporal, or the Little Corporal, a nickname that some say referred affectionately to his leadership style and camaraderie, not his height. Yet, this nickname didn't help settle the rumors. You can almost hear the whisper that started in British taverns. If he's so small, how did he conquer so much? The question lingers, spinning a new layer to the myth, one that mixes awe with mockery. You lean back now, imagining Napoleon's silhouette, not tiny, but perhaps average for his time, maybe even a bit taller than some of his contemporaries. The story you thought you knew begins to blur. It's a reminder that history, like sleep, is often interrupted by strange dreams and half-truths. You blink slowly, trying to focus on the strange world of old measurements and confusing units, where inches and centimeters don't quite agree, and everyone seems to be speaking a slightly different language. Napoleon's height, once so clear-cut in your mind as short, now feels slippery, like trying to hold water in your hand before bedtime. You're about to discover that the real confusion starts not with Napoleon himself, but with the measuring sticks used to judge him. Back in Napoleon's day, France had just switched from the traditional French foot, called the paille du roi, to the metric system, a brand new invention designed to bring order to chaos. But in Britain, they still used the imperial system, which meant their foot was a different length than the French foot. So when British newspapers reported Napoleon's height, they often quoted the number using their own inches and feet, which made him seem smaller than he really was. You might imagine Napoleon standing on a measuring stool as someone reads off 5 feet 2 inches, and the British scribes cheer, "Aha, tiny tyrant." but what they really measured was 5 pied 2 pouces, the French units, which actually convert to roughly 5 feet 6 or 7 inches in modern imperial measurements. That's about average height, or even a little above average for French men at the time. This measurement mishap is a classic case of lost in translation, with historians still arguing whether the British deliberately twisted the numbers or simply didn't understand the metric system's infancy. You feel a bit like a detective, piecing together old documents, trying to tell apart piedi from feet, pouces from inches, and wondering how a simple mistake turned into a centuries-old myth. And it gets stranger. Soldiers' accounts, letters, and even Napoleon's own doctor's notes give slightly different figures for his height, adding to the puzzle. It's as if every time someone tried to pin down his size, the numbers slipped a bit, like shadows dancing just out of reach. Maybe Napoleon was a bit shorter than today's average man, but certainly not the dwarf of popular imagination. The metric system's rollout itself was chaotic. You could almost hear the confusion. Wait, the foot isn't the foot anymore? How many inches in this pied thing? Some argue this measurement chaos contributed heavily to the myth's birth, while others say it was just a convenient excuse for British propagandists to keep the joke alive. You pause to consider that, for most of human history, height was a tricky thing to pin down. Even today, historians wrestle with fragmentary records and inconsistent data. So it's no surprise that Napoleon's stature has been debated fiercely, a small detail blown up to giant proportions. By now, you might be imagining a Napoleon who was not a tiny man shouting orders from a precarious ladder, but a confident general of normal stature commanding his troops. Maybe those inches and centimeters aren't just numbers, but symbols of how history can be shaped, or misshaped, by tiny misunderstandings. You settle into this revelation with a half smile, realizing that what you thought you knew was just the tip of a measuring stick, one that's been a little bent over the years. You lean back deeper into your pillow, the world around you dimming as you shuffle through dusty galleries of portraits, caricatures, and political cartoons that have immortalized Napoleon in more ways than one. You see how the image of the man evolved beyond mere physical height, shrinking instead into an icon of power condensed into a compact form. Paintings by his court artists show him standing tall and proud, draped in elaborate military regalia, but then the popular imagination, and especially his British critics, started painting a different picture altogether. You're staring at those infamous cartoons where Napoleon appears perched atop a tiny horse, his head barely reaching the saddle, or even clutching onto the heels of his much taller generals like a child desperate to be noticed. These weren't just innocent jokes. They were propaganda tools designed to diminish his stature, both literally and figuratively, to mock the little dictator who dared challenge British naval supremacy. It's fascinating how this visual shorthand became a lasting part of his legacy. Historians still argue whether this iconography was the main driver of the myth, or if it merely amplified pre-existing rumors about his height. Regardless, the images were everywhere, printed on newspapers, circulated as postcards, and repeated endlessly in pamphlets. They shaped public opinion in a way that mere words never could. But then there's the French side of the story, where portrait painters had their own reasons to depict Napoleon with a commanding presence. Some artists subtly adjusted proportions to make him look taller, broader, more imposing, a kind of visual spin on his reputation. You can almost hear the whispered debates among the artists. Make the hands smaller, the shoulders broader. Yes, this will make him look the hero the nation needs. And yet, here's a quirky tidbit for you. Napoleon himself was obsessed with appearances. He was known to be meticulous about his uniform and posture, knowing that image was a weapon as powerful as any army. But he reportedly disliked being called short and was sensitive about it, though he never let it show publicly. Maybe that's why he always wore his iconic bicorn hat, slightly tilted, casting a shadow to add a bit of mystery, or maybe just to hide a bad hair day. This section also drifts into the realm of scholarly debate about how much propaganda influences history. How much do these images reflect reality, and how much are they clever distortions? You realize that the short Napoleon image is less about inches and more about narrative control, a fascinating example of how history is shaped by stories we tell, not just facts. Finally, you catch yourself chuckling quietly, imagining Napoleon shaking his fist at some cartoonist while telling his aides, "Tell them I'm average height, but my ambitions are enormous." The myth of the small man with a big ego has nestled into popular culture so deeply that it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction now. As your eyelids grow heavy, you picture those exaggerated images one last time, a giant of history trapped in a tiny frame. You drift now, slipping softly into the curious world where history meets psychology, a realm where scholars explore why we're so obsessed with Napoleon's height in the first place. You find yourself tangled in a thread of ideas, stretching from the dusty halls of psychoanalysis to modern pop culture. The Napoleon complex, that catchy term everyone throws around when someone acts aggressively to compensate for being short, actually has its roots here, and it's more than just a joke. The idea is simple. Small men might develop a psychological need to prove themselves through dominance or assertiveness. You probably have heard someone say, "That's just a Napoleon complex," when they see a feisty short guy barking orders. But here's where it gets sleepy and scholarly. Historians and psychologists still argue whether this theory really applies to Napoleon himself, or if it's a post hoc label slapped on his legacy. You imagine Napoleon as a person, not a caricature, wondering if he really was driven by some subconscious need to make up for his height. His actions don't clearly prove it either way. He was undoubtedly ambitious, strategic, and fearless. Traits, you could argue, come from intelligence and drive rather than a complex about stature. Interestingly, some psychologists say the Napoleon complex is more myth than reality, pointing out that the research on height and aggressive behavior is inconclusive. It might just be human nature to make simple stories out of complicated people. You hear the academic whisper. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's supposed complex shaped his decisions, or if it's just a convenient explanation for a complicated figure. And then there's the cultural layer. You realize that societies often link physical size with power, or lack thereof. So shrinking a powerful man in stories is a way of undermining his influence. It's like the opposite of David and Goliath, but instead of a giant being defeated, a small man's threat is exaggerated. That paradox tickles you as you slowly nod off. Meanwhile, pop culture delights in spinning this myth. Movies, cartoons, and memes keep the joke alive, portraying Napoleon as a pint-sized tyrant with a gigantic ego. You find yourself yawning but amused, imagining a modern-day Napoleon stomping around with a ruler in hand, measuring everything obsessively. This section also gently unpacks how psychology and history intertwine to create myths that feel true even when they're not. You might almost believe that Napoleon's height mattered more to his psyche than to his army's tactics. But that's just the seductive power of a good story. As you relax further, the tangled mix of psychology, myth, and history slowly untangles in your mind, ready to drift away like clouds. Your eyelids flutter as you tiptoe now through the quiet halls where history's small print lives. The details that textbooks, pop culture, and late-night jokes have scribbled next to Napoleon's name for generations. You realize the short Napoleon myth is more than just a tall tale. It's a legacy that keeps shrinking and growing, passed from one storyteller to another, sometimes forgotten, sometimes exaggerated, but never quite corrected. You recall how school lessons often paint Napoleon as a man whose ambition was huge, but whose body was small. An easy metaphor that sticks in young minds like a catchy tune. Textbooks repeat the myth so confidently that it becomes fact in the collective imagination. Historians still argue whether these simplifications do more harm than good in understanding the man behind the legend. In movies, cartoons, and stand-up routines, Napoleon's stature is the punchline, a shorthand for the little guy punching above his weight. You imagine those cheeky portrayals, Napoleon jumping on his horse, tipping his hat, and complaining, "I'm not short, I'm concentrated." The myth has become a character all its own, separate from the historical figure. You pause to consider how this small but mighty image appeals to us today. It's almost comforting to think that great power can come from unexpected places, that someone small can change the world dramatically. It's a hopeful story, a whisper in the night that size doesn't limit ambition. Yet it's also a cautionary tale about how myths can obscure the truth, making it harder to see the full picture. Then there's one last quirky fact. The average height of French men has changed over centuries. So even if Napoleon was short by modern standards, he might have been average or even tall in his own time. History, it seems, is flexible, growing and shrinking like shadows at dusk. As you settle more deeply under your blankets, you recognize the irony that the short Napoleon myth actually reveals something bigger about history itself. How stories evolve, how facts get tangled, and how legends grow legs of their own, sometimes even outpacing the people they're about. And with that, you feel the weight of the day lighten, the myth dissolve gently into the twilight of your thoughts. The quiet night deepens, and your breathing slows as you nestle into the softness around you. The restless curiosity about Napoleon's height drifts away, replaced by a calm understanding that history isn't always neat or precise. It's a tapestry woven from stories, memories, and sometimes misunderstandings. You don't need to know exactly how tall Napoleon was to appreciate the vastness of his impact, the breadth of his ambition, or the echo of his legacy. Let your mind float on this gentle realization, soft and slow, like a leaf on a lazy river. Soon, the myths will fade completely, replaced by peaceful dreams and the quiet hum of your breathing. Tomorrow, when you wake, the story will rest gently behind you, a small but curious footnote in the vast chronicles of time. Good night.